Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could teach the gullible to never be so comfortable with lies they eat like comfort food? To disregard the bogus claims and pseudoscientific claims. Can you imagine just how much indeed the world would change? No more political predators playing on the populace with ilkas and plots to shift and kill metropolis. No more villains with the title in the Bible holding phony temper Bibles like the stuff they teach is vital. Imagine it was normal to have to prove a claim you make. And folks really feel ashamed to express some content that was fake. It's not to say we never make mistakes. It's just to say we go out of our way to show the evidence it takes.
Remain skeptical while you travel the road. The reason stay strapped with logic and fast. That's what it is, yo. Keep reality intact to help the truth grow. Question every claim, especially the ones you believe in. Remain skeptical while you travel the road. The reason.
Welcome to Road to Reason, A Skeptic's Guide to the 21st Century. I'm Paul Sheehan, director, producer, and host of this show. And I'm inviting you today to watch a conclusion of a series that we've had on the War on Christmas 2014. This will be taking place in the form of a pre-recorded show created by co-host and co-producer Rob Penczak. It is called No Mercy on Christmas. However, it is pre-recorded, so we will not be taking calls today. We invite you to tune in next week for comments. Prior to showing this clip, we have a small clip of Rick Wingrove at the Fairfax County Courthouse, of the Loudoun County Courthouse, talking about the atheist display there. And until next week and next year, this is Paul Sheehan bidding you, well, a Happy New Year. So I'm out here on the courthouse lawn of the Loudoun County Courthouse in Virginia. And as you can see today, as Rick Wingrove was talking about last week, the atheists have their big display here. The Christians have their cardboard cutout there. And then we have our secular Santa. So Rick, you were just explaining to me, if you could come over here and just point out the Santa rule. So if you want to just point out what this is all about.
Where you want me to stand here?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, interesting legal phenomena because of what is known as the reindeer rule or the Santa rule, to have that lovely plywood crash over there on the lawn. They have to convert it to secular display by adding a Santa over there. That converts the most iconic symbol of the largest religion on earth to a secular display so they can put it up. Now, it also creates an interesting legal situation, which I don't know, maybe we'll exploit someday, and that is to have that on the lawn, you got to have that on the lawn. But to have that on the lawn, you don't have to have that on the lawn. So we're thinking of getting a big giant inflatable Santa and putting it out here in July.
Interesting. Now, just a quick question here. If this giant Santa was holding an atheist sign, would that apply?
There's no limit on that.
Cool.
No limit on that. I mean, it's just an incredible irony because based on the legal fiction of the secularization of Christian symbology so that they can use it on the lawn, is that they create a situation where you can have Santa. You can't have Jesus on the lawn without Santa on the lawn.
Well, this atheist kid is definitely looking to a Christmas in July.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. We'll wait until like the day after Christmas and we'll hit Home Depot and get one of those 15-foot inflatable Santas. One of those.
Ho, ho, ho.
Hey guys, happy holidays, which as everyone knows is actually code for I declare war on Christmas. Let me kick things off with a warm thank you to all of the double-talking snakes over at Foxy Fox News, because without their constant spitting of venom and strangulation of the truth, this war that they've been scheming about and dreaming about for years might never have come to fruition. So, Christmas. Why are all of us secular Judases so hell-bent on stopping normal people from making merry on the winter solstice? Well, we're not actually. You see, this war on Christmas is just a convenient confabulation put forth by a privileged majority that wants to grind up the Constitution and use it for tinsel. Meanwhile, they like their infallible Bible, not sure which version yet, to become the law of the land. Exaggeration? Well, maybe the part about the tinsel. But when a sitting Supreme Court justice sees no problem with the government favoring religion over non-religion, well, Houston, then we've got a problem. And since we're stuck in Texas anyway, how about the efforts of the Texas State Board of Education, which is determined to poison a new crop of minds with counterfactual Bible-based textbooks? See, the problem with Christmas was never about stockings on the mantle or setting out milk and cookies for Santa. The problem is that a large portion of the radical right doesn't much care for the separation of church and state, which for over 200 years has protected believers and non-believers alike. But if the powers that be are intent on playing the victim, well, by God, then let's talk about Christmas. First off, forget about how the Grinch stole Christmas. Let's talk about how Christians stole Christmas, from pagan rituals like the Yuletide. And a word of warning to Christians who may not be very well informed about Norse mythology: Odin is not a god to be trifled with. He hung on the tree of life for 9 days, pierced through the side. And he's got a much-loved divine son, Balder, who died through treachery, but will be reborn to rule over a beatific earth after Armageddon, Ragnarok, brings this corrupt world to an end. Familiar? But getting back to the war. What would a war on Christmas be without a war on Christianity, and a war on Christ as well? And if we're going to do that, we may as well go all the way back to the beginning of the universe, or to the 6th day at any rate, to talk about Adam and Eve, with evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne, author of Speciation, Why Evolution is True, and the soon-to-be-released Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion are Incompatible.
Well, it absolutely rules it out. I mean, this has happened recently, and we can find this out because we can look at the variation in the human species at all the genes, and then we can, again, with some calculations of how much mutation occurs and population sizes and things like that, we can go back and back calculate the smallest that the human species must have been in the past couple million years. Because, if it was really, really tiny in two individuals, then in modern people we wouldn't have that much genetic variation amongst them. But we see a lot of it, and people have calculated, in fact, that since the human species left Africa, which is about 100,000 to 60,000 years ago, remember, the human colonized the whole world coming out of Africa during that period, that the smallest the population could have been was about 2,250 individuals. That's a minimum size. Yeah, in addition to those 2,250 individuals that left Africa, there were 10,000 that stayed in Africa, and all of those are the ancestors of the human species. So the smallest that the human species could ever have been, on reasonable assumptions and conservative ones, is 12,250 individuals. It could never have been two, as Adam and Eve story says, and as the Catholic Church still maintains, and it could never have been 8, which is the Noah's Ark bottleneck. Noah and his sons and their daughters, there were 8 of them. So population genetics absolutely rules out any kind of limitation in human population size that's very small.
As to what that implies about Jesus' death on the cross,
oh, it's pretty obvious what that does. And this is why the Roman Catholic Church is still in a dither about how to save Adam and Eve if, science and population genetics says it couldn't have happened. It means that we could not have inherited all of our sins from two common ancestors, because we never had two common ancestors. The Catholic Church maintains absolutely that we are all the genetic descendants of only two people, because that's how original sin gets passed on. Adam and Eve committed that original sin as if it were a gene, and sort of it's passed on to humans. Now, if there were not two humans, but 12,000 at minimum, then what does that mean for the story of two people who transgressed and made the human species sinful, and then Jesus had to come back and redeem us from that sin? And in fact, Jesus came back for a metaphor. Because if you have to see those two, the Adam and Eve story as a metaphorical story, which a lot of theologians are doing, then you're saying that Jesus came back and died for a metaphor, which is not very satisfying to theologians.
So how's that for an opening salvo, Christmas? The most fundamental tenet of the religion that gave you life is demonstrably bogus. And while slick-talking apologists can redefine Christ as a metaphor if it helps them win a debate, that doesn't change the fact that hundreds of millions of adherents who've been infected with the Christian bug do indeed believe that a non-metaphorical Christ literally died on the cross for humanity's sins. Now, if this criticism seems harsh, don't blame me. Blame this guy, David Fitzgerald, because his book Nailed was the inspiration for my song, which lies at the core of this critique. Or better yet, go right to the source and blame the founder of Christianity. David, would that be Paul the Apostle or Jesus?
Well, actually, it was neither. Christianity was around a long time before Paul. He complains a lot about his rival preachers, who are not just James and Peter and John, the head of the Jerusalem church, but also all these other rival Christians who are preaching other Jesuses and other Christs and other gospels. Most of what we know and love about Paul aren't things that Paul tells us. In fact, in a lot of cases, he says just the opposite. For instance, he never tells us anything remotely like, Jesus appeared to me on the road to Damascus. Okay, in my book Nailed, I talk about what he tells us his sources are for Jesus. It's scripture and revelation. He constantly denies that he learned about Jesus from anyone else, particularly the apostles, who he doesn't seem to like at all. And even in the New Testament, roughly half of the epistles that are attributed to Paul clearly weren't written by him, and that's something even Christian scholars agree on.
And here's Dr. Mark Reimers, a humanist leader and a neuroscientist with a background in statistics, genomics, and evolution, giving us some further context.
Many people in the ancient world thought of epilepsy not as a neurological disorder, the way we think of it, but rather as evidence of visitation from the gods. And so it's entirely possible that someone with epilepsy could have attained the status of a religious intermediary. If he did have epilepsy, it's possible that that could account for at least some part of the content of his vision on the road to Damascus. Certainly, a bright light and loud sounds are consistent with certain kinds of sensory manifestations of epilepsy for some people, not all. On the other hand, we see that St. Paul was an extremely organized and energetic person, constantly engaged in contentious issues and doing a lot of work micromanaging all of the churches he founded. I think that's inconsistent with someone who has severe epilepsy. So I think the evidence is that it's conceivable he would have been able to achieve status even as an epileptic, but it seems difficult to imagine that he could have exerted as much force in the early church as he did. However, I think we should also think about the psychological implications of his conversion experience. So remember, Paul was a very zealous Jew, a Roman citizen, very unusual for a Jew, and a student of Rabbi Hillel. And we see, as far as we can tell from evidence within the biblical text, he's someone who was never really accepted by the Jerusalem establishment, despite his evident zeal. Now, the teaching of Jesus bears an uncommon resemblance to the earlier teaching of Rabbi Hillel. We don't know if there was any direct transmission between Hillel and Jesus, but certainly many of the themes that Jesus expanded and elaborated on and put so poetically were themes that Rabbi Hillel had elaborated some 50 years before. So the question is, what is St. Paul? What is Paul thinking? He's trying to be zealous. He is, finding that he's not being accepted or recognized or accorded much status within Judaism. He finds all of these people who are proclaiming very similar values to the values he is sworn to uphold. And they are in desperate need of a leadership and an organized, systematic mind like his. And I think, after persecuting him for several years, he began to see that he could actually achieve a good deal of fame and make a substantial contribution to Christianity, as he in fact did. So much of Christianity, the systematic theology, is due to Paul rather than to Jesus. And so I think Paul saw that, in that moment, that perhaps he could reverse course and achieve many of his deepest desires through, upholding Christianity rather than persecuting it.
So if the Apostle Paul isn't who we've been led to believe, and if even a mortal historical Jesus is on shaky footing, then why in our age of technology do so many people still believe in Christian myths? Here to explain is Dr. Andy Thompson, a forensic psychiatrist and the author of Why We Believe in Gods.
One of my favorite quotes is Thomas Jefferson's. It goes like this: on the dogmas of religion as opposed to moral principles. All mankind, from the beginning of the world to the present day, have been fighting, quarreling, burning, and torturing one another over abstractions unintelligible to themselves and all others, and absolutely beyond the comprehension of the human mind. And what people do not realize is that if we were to see Mr. Jefferson today, we could say, Mr. President, religion is no longer beyond the comprehension of the human mind. We now understand how human minds generate religious beliefs. We understand the mechanisms that human minds use to generate religious beliefs. We know why human minds are vulnerable to thinking them, to spreading them, to accepting them. And we now know the neurobiology of ritual. We now know the ways in which rituals, the powerful rituals of all religion, draw people in and nail those beliefs to their brain. It's all there. And we could sit down with Mr. Jefferson and lay this all out to him in a way that I think he would understand and appreciate. And the task before us, I think, is educational, laying this out to everyone. Because one doesn't need to have a particular scientific education. You don't need to know all the details of neuroscience. The basic mechanisms of religion, the basic mechanisms by which rituals reinforce it, are all known now. We basically have the fundamental double helix, so to speak. We've got the fundamental structure of religion. We have the fundamental structure of the neurobiology of ritual. That knowledge is out there. And now I think the task is to get it into textbooks and to get it more widely known.
Dr. Thompson will do some of that educating in a bit. But first, let's go over Jefferson's point about people burning and torturing each other in the name of religion for as far back as we can see. For Christianity, you talk about the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch hunts, 2,000 years of branding Jews as baby-eating Christ killers, and let's not forget what the secular repressed and institutionally empowered clergy has done to generations of vulnerable children, and how that abuse has been purposefully concealed by the pious saints who floated to the top of the tank, so to speak, in their religious hierarchies. Yet the faith virus still leaves religious people scratching their heads when anybody thinks they can be moral without a fantasy father dictating their behavior from somewhere up in the clouds. Now, I've no doubt that some of these people would consider it a low blow to show Santa whipping a reindeer, but slavery is a part of the Christian tradition. And the fact is, the good ship Jesus, piloted by the good Christian Sir John Hawkins, with the blessings of the Christian Queen Elizabeth I, helped launch an exceedingly profitable trade of African human beings. Rick Wingrove is the Chief Executive Officer of Beltway Atheist and Virginia and D.C. Director for American Atheist. And here's what he had to say about the Bible serving as a roadmap for good morals, and also about religious founders and prophets being role models and good citizens.
You know, the Bible advocated slavery. It had suggestions for how the slaves themselves should deal with it. You know, just accept it, be a good servant to your master, and just deal with it. It seems kind of counterintuitive that so many people defend the Bible and are very literal about their interpretation of the Bible, but they get a little embarrassed and they just dodge the question when you bring up the fact that the Bible advocated for the ownership of other humans as slaves, and that never changed in the New Testament under the New Covenant, as they try to say. Jesus himself never said anything condemning slavery. He did say that the old rules should stay in place. They were not role models for me. Recall that these people were brutal. Death was just part of life for them, and people like Abraham, who was perfectly willing to murder his own son in the name of his religion. When you think about Moses, the Ten Commandments are held up as a model for morality for all people. But what you find out if you read the Bible a few verses later was that after Moses came down off the mountain delivering the commandments, he got laughed at, upon which he immediately killed 5,000 people of his own tribe. Jesus was ready to abandon his own family. Jesus said, bring the non-believers before me and slay them in front of me with a sword. So as much as they were into genocide and murder, and what is exactly the same thing as Sharia in their treatment of people, they're certainly not role models for me.
So that would be an emphatic no with regard to religious founders having the corner on ethics. And here's David Fitzgerald again with some fun facts about the birthday boy himself.
I'll tell you something about Paul. He's got one advantage all over Jesus, and that's that Paul was a real person. And the more I study the evidence for Jesus, the less I'm convinced that he was. In fact, saying that Jesus was the father of Christianity is a little like saying Mickey Mouse was the father of Disneyland. You couldn't have it without him, but that doesn't mean that he invented the whole thing. When you look at our evidence for Jesus, it's kind of dodgy right from the get-go. For a lot of what we know about Jesus, we have either no evidence at all, or we have not the best kind of evidence, but the absolute worst kind of evidence. In fact, when we look at the way Christianity evolved, the way Christian scriptures evolved, and how all that came together for the first 300 years or so of Christianity, the harder it is for me to think that there really was even an overrated, mere mortal human guy named Jesus. When you look at the official story that we get from Christianity about Jesus, there's at least 10 major ways that it fails the reality test. And these include things like, did eyewitnesses really write the Gospels? They didn't. Does history and archaeology corroborate the Gospels? They don't. Are the different Jesuses that we get in the Gospels even supposed to be the same person? Was he mentioned by other historians outside of Christianity? And did Christianity really spread rolling down and snowballing down Golgotha to take over the whole ancient world? For me, it comes down to one crucial paradox about Jesus, and that's either he did all these amazing things or at least taught these new radical teachings, and yet no one noticed outside his small fringe cult for over a century, or he didn't do these amazing miracles, he didn't teach these amazing things, and yet still, as soon as he's dead, you have all these fringe cultlets scattered not in Jerusalem and Judea, but all over the Roman Empire that can't agree about the most basic facts of his life. That alone, for me, is a huge red flag that we're dealing with something very different from what's presented in Sunday school class.
So if the Jesus story of Sunday school has nothing to do with reality, how is it again that Christianity is still around?
Marx was more correct than he realized. If you remember, Marx said that religion was the opium of the masses. And what he didn't know, which we now know, is that religion hijacks our own internal opium system. It hijacks our endorphins. Our endorphins are our own internal morphines, our own internal narcotics. And religion has various mechanisms, particularly song and dance and touch, that trigger our endorphins. So they trigger trust with the people that we're singing and dancing and believing with. So Marx was absolutely correct. Religion is the opium of the people. It stimulates our own internal opium to help us bond together even more.
Here's the tally so far. Christmas aside, we have eggnog, escapism, and social bonding. Against Christmas we have, well, it's not Christmas so much. Christmas is a pretty secular holiday in the minds of many participants. It's really the theocratic and authoritarian tendencies of those who insist on putting expressly religious manger scenes on public property, or dressing creationism up in scientific garb and trying to put it in the classroom, or taking the Ten Commandments and shoving those into the courtrooms because the Heavenly Father will only return us to favored nation status if we start stoning adulterers, fresh-mouthed teenagers, and those who don't keep the Sabbath holy. Then, of course, there's the pledge to the lie that America is a Christian nation. Never mind that our deist founders worked so diligently to script a godless constitution. Enough about misrepresenting history, though. Let's look at another crutch that Christianity uses to keep itself from toppling over. Faith. Faith is typically spoken of in glowing, reverent terms by the religious, and in derogatory ones with an air of disgust by those of us in the secular community, myself included. Dr. Peter Boghossian, professor of philosophy and author of A Manual for Creating Atheists, explains why neither of those moralistic appraisals are apt.
Formulating one's beliefs on the basis of insufficient evidence, or assigning a higher confidence value to a belief than is warranted by the evidence, is an epistemological problem. It's a problem of knowledge. It's not a moral problem. And so faith is not a virtue. Faith is a problem of thinking. Faith is a problem that people have when they're told that they should think in a certain way, when they're told that they should assign their beliefs higher confidence values than is what is warranted by the evidence. It is not a virtue. It is an epistemological sickness.
This distinction is important because if we keep it in mind, it can help turn our interactions with believers into empathetic collaborations instead of hostile confrontations. Keep in mind, however, that empathizing with someone doesn't mean you should simply tell them what they want to hear. If you ever see someone struggling with a serious dilemma, indeed, and you're tempted to tell them just keep their faith? Think about this.
Exactly the opposite counsel is warranted. Formulate your beliefs on the basis of evidence. The reason that people start having a crisis of faith in the first place, or start doubting their faith, is that they've become sincere with themselves. They've become honest with themselves. It's a way for people to admit to themselves that they were pretending to know something that they don't know. Bertrand Russell phrased it like this: people have bartered the desire to find out with the will to believe. So people stop wanting to find out what's true and start kind of willing themselves to believe something.
Wishful thinking simply won't help us improve our situation. Why then do so many fall victim to the lure? Michael Shermer and others have noted that the human brain is a belief-generating machine. That's why the scientific method and skepticism are so important. These processes allow us to identify our biases and minimize their impact, thereby helping us align our beliefs with reality. For another take on why that's important, here's Paul Sheehan, the producer of Road to Reason, A Skeptic's Guide to the 21st Century.
Well, I find religion harmful because people make real-world decisions based off of what is otherwise fantasy. People are making decisions that always inherently affect other people's lives when they're using religion to make decisions in politics and in their daily lives and how they interact with other people. Religion, for instance, is harmful if you believe, say, because of your deep-found religious beliefs and no esoteric beliefs of any type, that homosexuality is immoral and wrong. The way you're going to interact with people who are gay is going to be different, and it's going to be hostile on some level as to compared if you were talking to someone who was not gay. The same thing can be said, for instance, with the way that you may treat women. If your particular religious belief is that women are somehow inferior, you are going to approach women, even if it's on a subtle level, as if they're inferior. And this encroaches ultimately on the way our society interacts. If religion becomes institutionalized, the abuses, the harmful effects, then become institutionalized. A prime example of this is, say, for instance, one of the things I'm well known for dealing with is Scientology. Scientology and a small number of other churches in the District of Columbia were able to push through a law that basically makes it illegal to disturb their church services through protesting. The churches, for instance, can now determine what is and what is not disrupting their services, not the state. However, they are able to get the state to act on their behalf. So if they can hear you outside protesting and they don't like your message, unlike anyone else in our society, they can pick up the phone and make the state shut you up. And I would certainly call that harmful.
Beliefs affect the way people interact with the world around them. So if religion teaches a group that they are the chosen of God, graced with a secret decoder ring or encrypted set of blueprints that give them and them exclusively a higher understanding of the sacred truths that govern our world, then no one should be surprised when those believers commit atrocities based on those sacred truths. And just to be clear, the only thing sacred generally indicates here is that the alleged truth can't stand on its own merit. Larry Mendoza is on the board of directors of Beltway Atheist. He's got a master's in biology and a long-standing interest in Christian apologetics. And this is how he put it when I asked about whether or not the church was a good place to look for the truth.
The short answer is no. Religion tries to convince us of the truth by what my good friend C.S. McKinney calls the delusional matrix of systematic deception, otherwise known as religious apologetics. Churches make truth claims that cannot be backed up by any scientific evidence. Because of this, the church is required to develop rhetorical gimmicks, filter information, and exploit the epidemic of scientific illiteracy in order to convince us that they are telling us the truth. If the religious truth was so evident, then why do religions require pseudo-intellectuals who study how to perfect the delivery of the message rather than the message itself? Science is all we need. How do we know? Because it works. Science makes predictions that are testable and falsifiable. What has religion given us recently? How to deny global warming because of the impending apocalypse, that snakes used to talk and T-Rex used to walk with humans and eat coconuts, or even worse, that homosexuality is a sin that's punishable by death, and that women are to be exploited as incubators to be used and abused. I don't think so. I'll stick with science for my truth and my humanism for my moral ethic.
Sociologist Grace Tellini is an atheist activist and a host on Road to Reason. And here she is discussing one of religion's biggest lies, the notion that the rigid adherence to an arbitrary set of rules on earth can earn you a free pass to a mystical heaven.
You know, we only have this life to live, and as romantic as it is to imagine another world or heaven where everything is blissful, we really have this life. This is the life that we know. We have never heard about anybody coming back from the other world. So we need to do the best we can, get along with people, nurture people, be kind to each other, because this is it. You know, I know it's hard for us humans to believe that we only have this life. It's just, who doesn't want to live forever in a beautiful place and flying with big wings in the sky? Well, I'm one of those people who don't. I think I would be very, very bored. But so death does not frighten me, actually. I think that you can live a nice, long life or even short life and just leave good memories. Do your best. Treat people as the same way you want to be treated. That's my religion.
Now, I shouldn't need to point out that Grace is using religion very differently than, say, Pope Francis might. But you'd be amazed at what religious apologists latch onto. For instance, the notion that Einstein or Jefferson believed in a Christian God despite their crystal-clear statements to the contrary. And now we've got apologists talking about how dazzlingly brilliant the creator of Christmas was for having deigned to make us in his image through the roundabout mechanism of evolution. So here's Jerry Coyne once more to explain what evolutionary biologists really mean when they're talking about Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve.
Well, one hears a lot about Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve in evolutionary biology, and what they mean is that the mitochondrion, which is an organelle, a small part of the cell, and has its own DNA, that every bit of DNA in every mitochondrion in the human species eventually can trace back to a single female. Because we start off as eggs, which are female cells, then all the DNA that we get in our mitochondria comes from the female. And because of the vagaries of human reproduction, that some individuals reproduce more than others, that there's a limitation in offspring number, so there's variation. Eventually, any gene can be traced back to a single person. And for the mitochondrial Eve is the single person that bit of DNA in that cell organelle traces back to. So because these calculations have some uncertainty in them, the time that this female lived, who was the ancestor of all our mitochondrial DNA, was between 120,000 years ago and 340,000 years ago. So for every bit of DNA in both males and females and all humans, we can get a calculation of when the common ancestor lived that gave rise to that. And so for the Y chromosome, which is inherited in an opposite way from mitochondria, it comes only from the male. We can do the same thing and find out when the one male lived that gave rise to every Y chromosome present in the human species today. That's called the Y chromosome Adam. That individual lived between, we calculate, 100 to 200,000 years ago. There's two problems with that. First of all, people think that because one of them's called Adam and the other one's called Eve, that they must have lived at the same time. But that's not true. I mean, she's only called Eve because she is the ancestor of only a small part of the DNA in humans. Every part that we have comes from a different ancestor that lived at a different time, because all the genes are jumbled up through reproduction. The Y chromosome Adam, could have lived around the same time as the mitochondrial Eve, but almost certainly not. And there's a large span of time between 200 and 350,000 years ago when Eve could have lived and Adam couldn't. The term Eve and Adam have been misleading in so many different ways. All it really should convey to people is that every gene in the human genome traces back to a single ancestor in our past, but the different bits of DNA trace back to different ancestors who lived at different times.
Part of the problem in our country is that scientific literacy and critical thinking skills aren't a national priority. And the transformation of news into profit centers that have to entertain their viewers really hasn't helped.
Well, I think reporters in this country are doing a fairly poor job of separating science from religion. However, though, I think that this kind of trends over into other areas. We used to have this thing in this country, I believe it was called the Fairness in Reporting Doctrine, where they would allow two sides of a debate to kind of have equal time. We don't really have that anymore. And one thing, it is easy to say that reporters do a poor job in separating science from religion, but the reality is also that churches do a very good job of being aggressive about indoctrinating the press in what they want to be projected about themselves. I'm not so sure that the scientific community is geared up the way that it needs to be. The reporters, though, that's no excuse for reporters, though. Reporters do need to do a better job, and they also need to start learning tools for themselves to report accurately. And you cannot possibly be reporting accurately in this country if, in fact, that you go out to, say, a tornado or a hurricane. And I believe it was the case with Wolf Blitzer. And he asked this woman if she was grateful to God, and she made a response to, well, actually, I'm an atheist. Well, I think that speaks volumes as to how the press in this country approaches situations with the separation of science and fact and medicine and religion. They just assume everyone is religious, and they assume that people kind of go for the easy, emotionally invoked responses that religion puts out there.
Paul Sheehan ended that part with a reference to the compartmentalized thinking that allows nationally known reporters to put their awareness of science and facts on a shelf and go for the emotional response afforded by religion. Here's Dr. Andy Thompson again to put the pieces back together and show us how all of it works.
We don't like to think of it, but our cortex is a thinly added layer late in evolution that sits on top of powerful parts of our brain that are the emotional parts of our brain, our limbic system. And when you do song, dance, and trance, you're stimulating those chemicals, but you're stimulating those chemicals in your limbic areas, the limbic areas of your brain, the emotional areas of your brain. And a way to think about it, it's as if from the limbic system to the cortex, when you're driving in that direction, when you're pushing hormones through the tracks and you're going from limbic system to cortex, in that direction, it's like a 12-lane superhighway roaring along, and the limbic system is influencing the cortex very powerfully. When the cortex is trying to influence the limbic system and trying to go in the other direction from cortex to limbic system, it's like a 2-lane dirt road. It's like we're riding an elephant, and we think we're in more control of that elephant than we actually are. That elephant is the emotional, the ancient, emotional, neo-mammalian parts of our brain that generate powerful feelings. And the cortex is like the rider of that elephant that is trying to control it and is kidding himself about just really how much control he has, particularly if that elephant gets upset. And so what religions do is that, in a way, they hijack that piece of human nature. They bypass the cortex, as you put it, and they stimulate the limbic system. And they stimulate the limbic system in these ways, with these chemicals. And that's what leads them to generate behaviors, but also helps instantiate beliefs.
So that's a bit more about how religion can take control of our thinking, not by harnessing reason and logic, but by accessing the more primitive regions of our brain. And out of all the industrialized countries, America is the most hyper-religious one on the planet, though I did see that disputed in an article called Walking Santa, Talking Christ, which suggests that Americans aren't quite as religious as they'd have their neighbors believe. Either way, our politicians certainly cater to the religious zealots, which means that instead of implementing rational policies that can maximize the well-being for the whole population, the Christian right can turn their idiosyncratic Bronze Age bigotries into modern-day laws and policies. Whether that means shutting down women's health clinics, outlawing gay marriage, blocking research on stem cells, or installing Bible-based justices who proclaim racism dead and use that as an excuse to gut the Voting Rights Act and disenfranchise millions of voters who are eager to leave the Dark Ages behind. Now, here to give a bit of non-revisionist history and speak of the importance of Latinos in our often treacherous landscape is David Tamayo, president of Hispanic American Freethinkers and one of the founders of Camp Quest Chesapeake, where kids aren't taught what to think, but how to think critically for themselves.
So why should we care about Latinos in the U.S. and secularism? Well, some friends have told me that, maybe Hispanics haven't been here long enough and they haven't adapted, but I wanted to set up some facts first before we get going. So the term Latino or Hispanic, interchangeably for our purposes here, we can spend hours arguing about the nature of each one of those two words, but for now we'll just use them both like the government does, Latino or Hispanic. But basically, Latino or Hispanic is not a race, it's an ethnicity, and it's the largest ethnicity in the United States. We have 53 million Hispanics in the United States, and an ever-increasing number of those have voted in the previous elections, and they continue to grow for each one of the elections. Now, Latinos live today in the continental U.S. since the early 1500s. So Latinos have been around for a long time. And actually in 1775, Spanish ships were already in Alaska. And when the United States became independent in 1776, well, the majority of the continental US actually was Spanish controlled. So there were more, there was more Latino land, if you want to look at it that way, in 1776 than there is today. Still, the fact is that the number of Hispanics has continued to increase in the United States and now makes up 16.7% of the US population. Now, by 1783, the Spanish had claimed what is the majority of today's continental United States, and today 3 of the 4 most populous states in the United States have the largest number of Latinos, and that is Florida, Texas, and California have more Latinos than any other states, and they're the most populous states. So the U.S. today has more Spanish-speaking people than any other country in the world, except for Mexico. So that's why we need to care about Latinos and secularism. Hispanics in the U.S. have become the target audience for many of the religious people out there trying to convert them. And in fact, Latinos have a larger than average conversion rate. The Mormons, the Pentecostals, and yes, even the Muslims are after the Latinos and trying to convert them into their religions. And in fact, there's an estimate of about 200,000 Hispanics in the U.S. that have converted to Islam in less than in the last 10 years or so. So it's something that we need to worry about and something that we need to address.
This is an enormous group of people who will have a correspondingly large influence on the type of leaders we elect in the future. And while Hispanics aren't a monolithic bloc, we certainly need to do all we can to engage their communities with secular outreach programs and to educate them about the churches that seem to think them easy prey. Enough about how political the Christian right is. Let's talk about the other barb on their pitchfork: money.
The one thing that strikes me about the mega ministers is it reminds me of the parable of Jesus driving the moneylenders from the temple. Let me tell you, from my view, the moneylenders are all up in the temple. The moneylenders own the temple. They run the temple. And if you watch the TV shows, which I do just for fun, you'll see that money is all that they're about.
So money and religion. Money and religion really go to the heart of the church-state separation. There's currently an implicit agreement, or maybe not so implicit. There's an agreement that churches do not get to pay taxes on the trillions of dollars that they make every year, and that in exchange, they do not do any politicking. They don't push for a particular politician or a particular political party or anything like that. But obviously, there are some churches, there's a growing number of churches that feel that this does not apply to them. Or even better, they feel that this wall of separation is not really a wall, it's more like a filter, like an osmosis filter, a one-way filter, where they can do all the politicking they want, but they don't get to pay any taxes either. So, what bothers me really is that they're not happy with the deal that we have. They are not happy with just getting all these millions and millions and millions of dollars in tax breaks and not give any of it to the government. So priests, pastors, and all the peddlers of imaginary beings under the banner of religion get all these tax breaks. Like priests do not have to pay taxes on their homes and on their property, and the church is even better. They don't get to pay taxes on unrelated religious activities, such as large amounts of land, on their Lear jets, on daycare centers, on all these other activities where they're getting unfair competition because they don't have to pay taxes and everyone else has to pay taxes. So it's really interesting to see that this Bible, the Bible is pushed by these mega pastors at these mega churches, and they never seem to push a lot on Matthew 19:24, where it says that something along the lines that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, the eye of a needle, than for a rich man to go to heaven. Now, some of these pastors will argue that this is not their money. This is not their Learjet and their limousines or anything like that. No. This is God's equipment. This is God's, and they're just using it for a little while because, God's word is so important. Well, you need to come in and go first class every time, everywhere to deliver the word of God. And so, this is the reason why they're not rich. Their 10 limousines and their mansions and stuff, that's not their wealth. It's actually the church's wealth, although no one else gets to use it, certainly. So, bottom line is that I'm a little bit torn. I'm torn as to whether we should take away the tax break or not. I think the solution really is this: churches should follow the same exact identical rules that every nonprofit organization out there has to follow, and that is that they have to report how much money they're taking in and what they're doing with their money. They need to make sure that they're using it appropriately, that there's no conflict of interest, and that the donations that are being made are used for the things that they said they're going to be used. And that's something churches do not want at all. And that's something that I think will make things more honest and less mega pastors out there living better than kings ever lived anywhere on the stupidity, ignorance, and foolishness of the people that believe in imaginary friends. So I think that's my solution to that, and I hope that will happen someday within my lifetime, although I doubt it very much.
Money and power have often gone hand in hand. But with Citizens United and similarly mind-numbing court decisions, the two are now locked in a carnal embrace. Which brings us to our next topic, sex. Now, I did take a few pokes at Christianity for its hang-ups regarding sexuality, but in all fairness, that was just a song. Whereas Christian politicians aren't above poking real probes into real women's vaginas in defense of invisible souls which apparently anneal to fertilized eggs through the magic of a loving deity who ironically chooses to end most of those conceptions owing to his ribald nature in mysterious ways. Seriously, we've had Christian candidates proposing legislation against birth control without the faintest clue of how all that messy girl stuff works. And we had Kenny the Cooch crusading to reinstate Virginia's anti-sodomy laws. And just recently, a teenage boy was threatened with jail time because he snapped a lewd picture that made it look like a statue of Jesus was giving him a blowjob. Here to explain why religion is so hung up on these matters is Darrell Ray, author of God Virus, How Religion Infects Our Lives and Culture, and Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality.
Boyfriend. It's pretty obvious. Probably Joseph didn't know she was pregnant. When folks found out she was pregnant, in that day and age, the law was you stone the girl to death if she's not a virgin when you get married. So Joseph had a pretty important decision to make. Do I marry this girl or do I let her father let the village stone her to death? So he made the choice. I'll go ahead and marry her. But now that means he's raising another man's son, and that wasn't very popular back then. So rather than go through all the machinations of explaining to everybody, they headed out of town. And they stayed out of town long enough for they have the baby and a few months extra pass so that when they come back, it looked like, yeah, they had the baby and it was Joseph's baby. That's a pretty good alternative explanation. So why the hell is the church hung up on virginity and the notion that Mary had to be a virgin? Why the hell is virginity important to anyone at any time? Only if you have a patriarchal religion trying to control women. This story is the root of much slut-shaming, much misogynistic behavior in our culture, and the essence of controlling women within a religious dogma. We need to get rid of the notion of virginity. It has no value in modern culture. It is most insidiously perpetuated in the purity culture of many fundamentalist churches these days, and of course throughout Catholicism, where virginity seems to be the main theme of everything, from virginity of the nuns to the priests to no sex before marriage. I mean, all sorts of aspects of virginity just pervade these religions. Once you began to get rid of virginity, the notion of virginity, then you attack the dogma at its root. Control of women is what religion's all about. And let's get rid of the notion that is the root of the control system that all patriarchal religions use, virginity. And that's my story of Christmas. Happy holidays.
Controlling women instead of treating them as equals. Who could possibly have a problem with that? In case the slaughter of Muslims by other Muslims hasn't already made it abundantly clear, maybe the diminution of women by every patriarchal religion can serve as a reminder that religion isn't just harmful to people in designated outgroups, who are promptly dismissed as strident or shrill. Religion is also harmful to the people who buy into it. And always keep in mind that children aren't so much buying into anything as they're being sold down the river by their parents who have been infected by a given strain of faith. So we reviewed a lot of reasons why Christmas time in America, in the form of a Christian theocracy, isn't likely to make our country especially merry for anyone, including Christians. And that points us toward a riddle. If religion is harmful, and Darwin's theory is true, why hasn't evolution already dumped religion by the wayside? This is another card religious apologists like to toss on the table as if it were the ace of trump. And here's Andy Thompson once more to explain why the apologists still have a losing hand and why there is no cap on the crap we can say when we're singing a hymn, from a neurochemical point of view.
The original religion of our Homo sapiens ancestors in Africa was song, dance, and trance. There's superb evidence for that. If you look at Nicholas Wade's book, The Faith Instinct, he lays it all out. And that original religion, song, dance, and trance, can be seen in the societies, the Kung Song, the Andaman Islanders, the Aborigines, and those three groups, their religions are identical, and they're all based around song, dance, and trance. It was the original religion for our species. Why? There are a number of reasons. Let's take song. We now know that music stimulates endorphins in our brain. Everybody thinks of endorphins as reducing pain and the runner's high. Endorphins are even more important. Endorphins enhance trust. So when we sing, we're filled with endorphins. That's what helps us enjoy the music, but it also helps us bind to the people we sing with. What's dance? Dance is rhythmic movement. Rhythmic movement is full of triggers to enhance all sorts of neurochemicals in our brain. We know, for instance, that it boosts serotonin, the same neurochemical that antidepressants boost. What does serotonin do? Serotonin enhances self-esteem. Serotonin pulls us out of ourselves, out of our ruminations. It has us focus outward. Rhythmic movement boosts dopamine. What is dopamine? Everybody thinks of dopamine as the pleasure chemical, but dopamine does a bunch of other things. Dopamine boosts motivation. Dopamine boosts attention. Dopamine also marks those things that are important. So if we're involved in rhythmic movement and boosting dopamine, what's going on at that time is marked as important. Religious beliefs that are being talked about at the time of the service. You also get norepinephrine, adrenaline. That boosts our heart rate. That adds excitement. It can also add fear, and we remember the things that we're fearful about. Well, that goes on in religions. And most people think of religions as the beliefs, as the belief systems. But what has not been appreciated is how those belief systems become really solidified in our brain. And they become solidified in our brain through the rituals.
So that's how it works. That's how Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and all the rest sink their hooks into their unwitting prey. And the best defense against those hooks is critical thinking, which is more important than ever in our modern day and age. Here to wrap things up with that is Peter Boghossian.
I think that it's always been important. I do think that it's more important now, and I'm hoping that that's just not a form of cultural myopia on my part. And the reason I think that it's particularly important now is that we have instant access to information. We're barraged with the internet, and my son is on Instagram, and we have new ways to access information that we didn't have access to before. But we also have very adept propagandists. We have people who use Photoshop, who change images to make those images appear as if one thing is happening when it's actually not happening, and it's particularly disturbing in a political context. And so this idea has even been extended to the fact that people are using fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to understand people's behavior at the level of the brain and then tailor communication and advertising messages to them. That's pretty creepy and spooky stuff, and once you start doing that, then the normal tools of critical rationality are much more difficult to help one differentiate make-believe land from reality. But critical thinking is particularly important right now precisely because we are barraged by so much, and because the level of the game has gone up, whether one wants to attribute that to capitalism and selling things and the capitalist mechanism, or whether one wants to say that propagandists and political propagandists in particular have stood on the shoulders of giants like Goebbels. That's not a moral judgment about Goebbels, obviously, but it's a judgment about the efficacy of his methods. That we now are faced with we're in a very, very difficult situation where we're faced with competing claims and competing ideas. Many of those have been specifically designed to resonate with us, and we have a cognitive architecture that predisposes us in the first place to liking one message or another. So having tools to differentiate what's true from what's false is an indispensable skill set for this century.